Good afternoon, New York, and the rest of our listeners around the globe. My name is June Stoyer, and I'm the host of the Organic View radio show. Our podcast is available on iTunes, Zune, and you can also visit our website at www.theorganicview.com. If you have any questions for our guests, there are many ways you can contact the show. You can post a question on our wall on Facebook, Skype us, send us a tweet on Twitter to @TheOrganicView, or you can contact me directly at June Stoyer. If you'd like to be on the show or would like to find out about sponsorship opportunities, please contact us at questions@theorganicview.com. There's been a huge debate over the impact of neonicotinoids, which are a class of systemic pesticides with a common mode of action that affects the central nervous system of insects, causing paralysis and death. Neonicotinoids are often applied to seed treatments, which means coating the seeds before planting. They also generate billions of dollars for the agro-chemical companies that manufacture these chemicals and are available not only for agricultural applications, but also can be found in a myriad of garden products available all over the world. As the peer-reviewed, independent scientific evidence mounts from reputable scientists around the world that these chemicals are the cause of global honeybee decline, the industry still claims that they are not to blame. The industry also argues that without these systemic pesticides, agriculture will suffer, resulting in crop failure. Similar to the big banking conglomerates and other industries that are, quote, too big to fail, are neonicotinoids the next to join this lineup? In this special series called the Neonicotinoid View, my guest co-host Tom Theobald and I will be joined by the president of the Professional Beekeepers Association, Mr. Walter Haefeker, to discuss the value of neonicotinoid seed treatment in the European Union. So I would first like to welcome my special co-host, Mr. Tom Theobald. Good afternoon,
Hello,
Tom.
June.
And our guest today, Mr. Walter Haefeker. Good afternoon, Walter, and welcome back to the show.
Good afternoon, June and Tom.
Walter, thank you so much for joining us. You've been featured on this show several times, but for our new listeners that are tuning in, that are just learning about you and all the wonderful work that you do, could you please tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and how you got involved with the issue of neonicotinoids?
Well, I'm a beekeeper in Bavaria, and I'm on the board of the German Professional Beekeepers Association, and I'm also serving as president of the European Professional Beekeepers Association. In this capacity, of course, any issues that arise in the beekeeping community, we have to deal with at the board level. And this is now almost 10 years ago. Our French colleagues alerted us to problems that they were observing in sunflower and some other crops. And they alerted us to the fact that this seems to have something to do with a new generation of pesticides that has come on the market and has become very popular with farmers. And we were off to the races.
There's a big lobbying fight in the European Union about banning neonicotinoids. Why is there so much resistance to the proposed ban?
Well, neonicotinoids are a class of insecticides that has basically replaced many of the older generation insecticides and is now the most important set of chemicals that are used in agriculture to control a variety of pests. So we're not talking about some minor uses here, but we're talking about a group of insecticides that are now used in 120 countries around the world and are used on at least 50 different crops. Making changes to protect the bees basically is something that is going to rock the boat of a lot of people that have gotten used to working with these insecticides.
Walter, what are the arguments on the industry side that are in favor of the continued use of these?
Well, it started out, and it seems like they're still in the state. It started out with denials. When beekeepers first observed the problems, of course, industry said the problems that you're seeing are due to a whole bunch of other factors, but our products are safe. They have been tested, they are approved, they are much better than earlier products, they are systemic. They're used as a seed treatment. Bees don't fly below ground where the seed is placed. So their main argument was the problem that the beekeepers are seeing doesn't exist. Then the next step was when the commission proposed the ban. They said not only are we confident that our products are safe, if you ban these products, this will have a huge economic impact on agriculture because agriculture is currently dependent on these products being available. So they commissioned a report that was released about a month ago to coincide with this lobbying fight, where they had compiled all the uses of their products and compiled all the benefits that they think these products having for the farmers. And rightfully, there were some press headlines that the industry is forecasting economic Armageddon if a neonic ban is passed. They're claiming that in the EU alone, this would basically mean a loss of 17 billion euros to the European economy and 50,000 jobs in the farm sector. So
one beekeeper posed to me the question of just who should stand those losses. They've led agriculture into a destructive technology and it's failed. Should the taxpayers and the farmers be subjected to those losses, or should they come out of the profits that were gained from these products?
Well, I think there is a big parallel. This agricultural disaster that they're producing is very similar to the banking crisis, where we all know what mistakes were made, but nothing is being done about it. And the argument is they are too big to fail, and their executives are too important to prosecute. So in the case of neonics, the situation is that the industry is claiming our products are too big to ban. And this is certainly unacceptable to the beekeeping community and should also be unacceptable to anybody caring about pollinators and songbirds and a healthy environment in general.
Yes.
You also have to keep in mind that their compilation of all the negative economic effects of a ban basically assumes that there is no other way to do agriculture. But there is plenty of evidence that smart farmers can work without these products. In Italy, before they instituted their neonicotinoid ban, they commissioned a study, and they not only looked into the impacts that they found on the honeybees, but part of the study was also to try to grow corn, which was the main crop that was causing problems there. So they tried to grow corn without neonicotinoids, and they did a side-by-side comparison, and the loss in yield was basically non-existent. The corn production in Italy after they did their local ban actually increased. So some of this is just scare tactics. Certainly, farmers for certain crops would have to learn a few new tricks or do some crop rotation. We might have a little bit more diversity in agriculture afterwards, but there are plenty of good reasons to do that anyway. because right now the recommendations by the World Agriculture Report is basically if we want to feed a hungry world, so that's where industry. So one of the arguments of industry is that these products are essential for the current farming economy. Farmers have to have these products available. There are certain crops where no other approved insecticide is available. And therefore, they're assuming that if you take these insecticides away, farmers will suffer severe economic losses.
And we've seen some reports over here recently that a more traditional form of agriculture, side by side with these new technologies, have shown to be to give better yields. Can you comment on that?
Yes, this is also the evidence that we've seen in a number of reports, especially if they're translating this argument into an economic argument, not the environmental impact, but the economic impact. Then number one, you have to say that the farming system that they're trying to protect is very energy and capital intensive, and it has high input cost, which lowers the profit margins of the farmers. And also, especially in Europe and other Western countries, the problem that the farmers are having is overproduction suppressing prices. So there's been an important study in the US a few years ago where they looked at a situation where a new technology would increase the yield of all farmers in a sector by 5%. And so normally everybody in the gut feeling is, okay, if all the farmers have 5% more yield, then the price goes down by 5% and everybody stays where they were before. But it's actually worse, because in a saturated market, this 5% allows the buyers to play everybody off against each other, and the prices are lowered not by 5%, but by 20%. So it's not necessarily a consequence of slightly lower yields that the farmers make less money. And therefore, you have to look at the question of economic impact. You have to look at the different crops and whether you actually have a saturated market or not. And especially in the countries that we're talking about in Europe and the United States, for many crops, that's the case.
Thank you, Walter. What is the industry's new buzzword, sustainable intensification, all about?
Well, I first learned about this at an event, a Syngenta-sponsored event in Brussels. Right now, they're trying to convince politicians around the world that the world population is exploding. We're going to have to feed 9 or 10 billion people in a few decades. And the way to do that is by using the available resources, land and water, even more intensively. And since everybody understands that we're probably already going too far with this intensification, they found a new buzzword for what they want to do, and this is called sustainable intensification. When I first heard about it, it immediately reminded me of clean coal. It's essentially an oxymoron, and it is also not what a major UN effort a few years ago came up with when they were asked to come up with a way to feed the growing world population. There's a World Agriculture Report that came to very different conclusions than what the industry is trying to push right now.
I've also seen a new word they've used called proportionality. Is that part of your law over there, or is that something of their creation?
Um,
They've used it.
these,
They've used it in argument against the precautionary principle. They've said that we
uh,
have to consider proportionality.
yes, essentially what they're trying to say is that the precautionary principle is a principle that you can use to justify not getting out of bed in the morning. Okay, so if you have a problem that you've identified and a risk associated with it, the response should be proportional to the risk that you've identified. And so, in their mind, the risk to bees is negligible. And in their mind, the economic impact is horrendous of a ban. And so, if you downplay the risk and you play up the economic consequences, then you reach the conclusions that the response is not proportional. But this whole discussion right now about applying the precautionary principle is pretty amusing, because a precautionary principle would suggest that you act on early warnings and not that you use a product for 17 years and you wait until the last bee dies before you take action.
Walter, what can consumers do? There are a whole myriad of products that are available, and it's very misleading. What do you advise our listeners as far as what they can do?
Well, there are always two levers that consumers have to try to have an impact. One is in your purchasing decisions. You can look at, are we buying products? Are we buying food or energy products where these neonicotinoids have been used? And the other more direct question is, am I actually using this in my garden? Have I looked at the ingredient list of my garden chemicals, and is there one of the neonicotinoids on it? Actually, in some countries, there has been pressure on garden centers and also online retailers like Amazon to simply take these products off the market because they have no place in farming and certainly no place in somebody's garden.
What would you recommend to people that are trying to do something in their area as far as getting the local retailers to stop offering these products on their shelves?
Well, I think first of all, take a look at the ingredients list, and maybe in the show notes you can publish the names of the neonicotinoids so that your listeners can check the ingredient list, because it will not say neonicotinoid on it. It will say imidacloprid, for example, on it. So have a list and check it. And if you find this in your local garden center, ask them why they're offering it. Right now, there's a petition in the UK, and we're probably going to launch one in Germany too, to petition Amazon to no longer sell these products online. The companies that are selling these products and that are lobbying hard to keep them on the market are publicly traded. So consumers that are investing their retirement fund, they can take a look at whether these companies should be part of their portfolio.
Walter, we're beginning to see what appears to be a media campaign on the part of Bayer to show how deeply they care for bees and to shift the argument away from the systemic pesticides and focus primarily on Varroa. Are you seeing similar efforts over there?
Well, this was actually their first reaction when the French beekeepers discovered the connections of the losses that they saw with Bayer's and Syngenta's products. Their first reaction was to sponsor research into losses with almost exclusive focus on losses that could be blamed on Varroa. This has been going on for many years now. When you visit the Bayer Bee Care Center, which they've opened as part of their greenwashing effort, they actually have a training room to supposedly educate beekeepers. And in this training room, they have a model bee and a model Varroa mite. And the model mite is almost bigger than the bee itself. So you can see that their perspective on this is a little bit distorted. Varroa, of course, is a problem for beekeepers around the world, and it has made beekeeping more difficult. There are additional steps that you have to take as a beekeeper to control the mite. And it makes sense for the beekeeping community to get even better at controlling it. But we had a big debate here in Germany where several scientists have clearly stated that the claim that the industry is making, that the Varroa mite is the primary cause of the losses, is not supported by their evidence. And there is plenty of research that shows that Varroa may be more of a symptom than a cause, because neonicotinoids are a neurotoxic group of chemicals. Your listeners all know what maybe not if they live in Utah, but most of them know what a neurotoxic chemical is and what effects it has. The ones enjoyed by humans the most is alcohol. And long before alcohol kills you, it can have all kinds of effects on you that make it impossible for you to drive a car or do your job properly.
Yes, that's a very, very good point.
And the same thing is happening to the bees. So the bees are constantly exposed to these chemicals because they're so widely used. In the UK, they were trying to do a field trial, and it turned out at the end of the trial that apparently it was impossible for them to have a neonicotinoid-free control in their trial. This is a clear indication of how pervasive the exposure is. So a honeybee colony that is in good condition is able to suppress Varroa to some extent, even colonies that are not fully resistant. You also have an effect that has been recently demonstrated of neonicotinoids on the brood temperature. And Varroa loves cooler brood. And you can see in this research that the bees, if they're intoxicated due to exposure with neonicotinoids, are maintaining the top brood temperature properly, but the lower end of the spectrum is 2 degrees centigrade lower than what it should be. And every beekeeper knows that you're just inviting all kinds of bee diseases when the bees, for one reason or another, cannot maintain the proper brood temperature. So all of this clearly indicates that when you at the end look at the hive and you find Varroa, that this may be only the last thing that moved in to finish off the hive.
In other words, Varroa itself may be a symptom rather than a cause.
Exactly. Not in all circumstances, but there are certainly a number of circumstances where it definitely looks this way. So the debate, is it either Varroa or these insecticides, it's a false debate. Both factors contribute to honeybee losses, and from the research that I've seen, I think there is quite a bit of synergy between neonicotinoids and Varroa, a lot of beekeepers have observed that when Varroa was first introduced, honeybees, the colonies could handle quite a bit of them without actually collapsing. And now the threshold, the number of mites that are associated with a collapse is much, much lower. So there's something going on that is beyond just the Varroa question.
Thank you, Walter. That's very helpful.
Another observation, in the US, the range of Varroa treatments available to beekeepers is actually much higher than what we have available in Europe because of a different regulatory framework. Normally, this would you would assume that American beekeepers would have much less of a Varroa problem, and therefore, if the industry is right, much lower losses than we have in Europe. But as the numbers that are just coming in from this winter show, that is definitely not the case. Even though you have a lot more Varroa treatments available, your losses are at least as high, if not higher, than what we're seeing in Europe.
The evidence from Australia is interesting, and in fact, we interviewed Jeffrey Gibbs.
Mm-hmm.
Bayer has contended that they have no problems in Australia, and neonicotinoids are extensively used. The information that's coming from the beekeepers is that they're having horrible losses, and they have no Varroa in Australia.
Yeah, they made the same claims about Japan. Interesting is that in Japan, about 3,000 beekeepers are keeping the traditional Japanese bee, not the European bee. This traditional bee has always lived with Varroa and is Varroa resistant. And they're having the same losses than the other beekeepers that are working with the European bee. So even when you have Varroa-resistant bees, you're still going to suffer these losses. And another important point is we're always talking about our honeybees, but a lot of studies have come in recently about bumblebee populations. And bumblebees do not suffer from Varroa at all, and they're not suffering from incompetent beekeepers handling them. And these populations still manage to collapse. So there is definitely, there are some flaws in the logic of the industry. And Varroa, of course, is something, the mite doesn't look very pretty. You can scare the public with the monster mite, but when you look at this closer, the mite is something that we as beekeepers have to control, of course, but the mite is not the answer to the question of why you have this overall decline of bees around the world.
Thank you.
Walter, would you briefly discuss the German bee monitoring project?
Yes. When the French beekeepers came to Germany to alert us about the neonicotinoid problem, and the German beekeepers were starting to ask questions about it, immediately Bayer, Syngenta, and BASF found €500,000 to set up the German bee monitoring. And that's always the tactic of the industry. Even now where the EU-wide ban is being proposed, their answer is, let's study the problem for a few years and with a monitoring project. So it was pretty clear from the beginning that the goal of this monitoring was to buy time, and the goal was to find some other factor to blame the losses on. I was asked by my colleagues to serve on the oversight board of this monitoring project. And the first thing that I noticed before the project even got off the ground was that the budget had actually €0 allocated to residue analysis for neonicotinoids. So if just looking at the budget, it was clear where they wanted to look and where they didn't want to find anything. The project continued. We as beekeepers actually had to force them to do at least a minimal amount of neonicotinoid analysis. We threatened to pull out of the whole project if they didn't. And then in 2011, there was a supposedly scientific publication in Apidology summarizing the result of the monitoring project so far. And the goal of this publication was to give the industry ammunition to claim that neonicotinoids are not associated with honeybee losses. So it turns out that the whole project was conducted so poorly in terms of how the data were being gathered, how the statistics were done, that two independent scientists that we didn't pay for, they were actually not from the beekeeping community. They just saw all the articles in the press that supposedly this German bee monitoring had found that Varroa is the cause of these honeybee losses. And so they started analyzing this scientific publication and were so upset with how bad the science was in there that they published a review paper in Germany. And they were kind enough to translate it into English. A few days ago, the product was finished, so that in the debate right now in Europe, whether to ban neonicotinoids or not, the German bee monitoring is probably accounted for. The German government, being close to the chemical industry, is trying to prevent this EU-wide ban from happening, and is telling the other member states that the German bee monitoring found that there's no neonicotinoid problem. So it is very important that we have an independent review of this project that clearly shows that this is not a project that can give you, that can actually answer the question properly of whether neonicotinoids are a problem or not. These two scientists were not the only ones that looked at the German bee monitoring. Bayer, a few years ago, made the mistake of submitting the data from the German bee monitoring to the French regulatory body in order to get one neonicotinoid-based product approved. The French regulatory agency looked at the data, wrote a pretty scathing report about the poor quality of the data, and refused to approve this product based on the data. So this is another indication that the German bee monitoring has nothing to offer here. When EFSA was asked by the Commission to look at all scientific reports that are available about the impact of neonicotinoids, they did not even look at the German bee monitoring and its publications. I think they correctly determined that this German bee monitoring doesn't have anything to offer here.
And for those who aren't familiar with the acronyms, EFSA is the European Food Safety Authority, isn't that correct?
Yeah, the European Food Safety Authority is in charge of among other things, the rules for approving pesticides. And the European Commission asked the EFSA, this scientific body, to compile the data available on the losses and then make a recommendation. And this recommendation is actually the reason the Commission is now trying to do a ban. This is the chemical industry is actually grasping for straws here, because the few studies they can point to that are not finding a problem are very poorly done studies that in many cases they have paid for. And the evidence on the other side that there, in fact, is an impact on bees is so overwhelming that EFSA, which is not known to be biased towards environmentalism, we had a lot of battles with them and still do around the GMO issue. When EFSA says there is a problem, they're not looking at a mouse, they're looking at an elephant.
Thank you, Walter. I just have one question that I'd like both of you to answer, and I'll begin with Tom. The question is Varroa something that is more of a symptom or the overall cause for honeybee decline?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'm not sure we have the complete answer to that, but the evidence is that for whatever reason, colonies that have been compromised, and we believe that to a large degree that compromising of the immune system is the result of exposure to the neonicotinoids, an organism, a superorganism like a colony of honeybees that has been compromised is much less able to deal with the Varroa mite. And there is also evidence that these chemicals may in fact facilitate the life cycle of the Varroa. In other words, the Varroa thrives in the presence of this effect. So the evidence is still emerging, but there's little question that the neonicotinoids are contributing to the Varroa problem, that the neonicotinoids are the major cause of our losses, and that the Varroa is secondary and may in fact be worse because of the neonicotinoids. In that case, would be considered a symptom.
Thank you, Tom. Walter, can you answer the same question?
Sure. Especially when you're talking about causality, saying something is the cause of something else. Scientifically, that's a pretty high standard to meet. And the Varroa mite is something that you can observe with the naked eye. So it's very easy to say, okay, I've got a dead colony here. I see some Varroa mites. I attribute this loss to Varroa. But we all know how this can be very different from human health. Before people discovered that there was such a thing as the AIDS virus, a lot of death certificates for people stated that somebody died from pneumonia. We now know that the pneumonia was a symptom and the underlying cause was something else. And you have a very similar situation with the Varroa mite, where the Varroa mite can be easily observed. The other factors that are contributing to the spread of Varroa in a colony are much, much harder to observe. So a observer that doesn't have a lot of money and resources to do a proper analysis can easily get confused and think that all of these losses are due to Varroa. And the industry, on the other hand, they have the knowledge, the money, and the resources to know better. They know that there is scientific evidence that shows that there's interaction between Varroa and their products. But it's very convenient for them to blame Varroa and not look at the underlying causes here.
Walter, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It has been interesting just learning about the different things that you're involved with, but also your opinions are so greatly valued as you're very well respected, especially with the important work that you do with honeybees. So once again, thank you for coming on the show.
Yes, thank you, Walter. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I never fail to learn something when we talk.
Well, I can say the same thing about you. It's always a pleasure to talk to both of you. And I not only enjoy being on the show, but I'm also enjoying listening to the other shows that you're producing. Your work is very valuable to educate everybody about what's going on with neonicotinoids. Thank you very much for that.
And folks, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been June Stoyer with the Organic View Radio Show. Have a great afternoon, everyone.